Hi everyone, please subscribe to the channel. I really appreciate it. Thank you. So in looking at our current situation on a political level in the United States and on a world level as well, it helps to look at where the current planets are and compare to prior periods, prior eras when similar cycles were in play. And this is where you see that in the current situation that we're in, there are important planets in locations of the zodiac that are very similarly aligned with the Civil War in the US of the 1860s and with the Second World War positions, which explains why we're having difficulties here, but there are a lot of difficulties really literally everywhere, even if you assign part or much of the blame to the US because of the current leadership. Now, first, to understand this, if you look at the American chart and you assess the various planets, one of the reasons I've used the whole sign system for many years is this very chart, because I think it signals something really important that if you assess it via the conventional quadrant systems like Placidus, Koch, Campanus, Regiomontanus, where they use the position of the midheaven to be the start of the 10th house. In those systems, they would say two planets that the US chart appeared to be actually very strong. In those systems, they have to be labeled as weak because they occupy cadent houses, Uranus and Neptune. They would be in the 6th and 9th, Uranus for the 6th, Neptune for the 9th. And yet, those planets, to my understanding, vibrate very, very strongly in the American chart. And if you use the whole sign system, then Virgo is the 10th, Gemini is the 7th. Those planets become angular, become a lot stronger. In fact, become extremely important as a result of their angularity. And in that same analysis, you would see that the US has many, many planets in cardinal signs, even though they are not angular, such as the Cancer planets, the Capricorn planets, Saturn in Libra, Chiron in Aries. All these planets are not angular in terms of the house position, but they are cardinal, and cardinal is similar to angular. Hence, a great deal of empowerment and importance, to the American empire, the American experiment. But going back to Neptune and Uranus, you then can realize that these planets, when they move, they make aspects, they make connections, they're going to be very important. Indeed they are, because if you look at the Civil War of the 1860s, Uranus was returning to its natal position. Going back to 1776, Uranus is in Gemini, the country is created. 84 years later, roughly, which is the cycle of Uranus, it returns, and you have a civil war together with Neptune just entering Aries around the same time. And the explanation for that is that Neptune would be moving into squares to the early Cancer planets, Venus and Jupiter. And if you look back in those years, you go back to the 1850s and to just before the war, basically up to 1860, there was a theme in the US that is really similar to the current theme, meaning there was a major racial divide, a major conflict, which led to a war, a hot war in that case. And now all these years later, we're experiencing really what looks to be the same conflict in a different flavor, but it's really the same idea. The white majority of the country in the current era is upset with what is happening. Back in the day, it was the South and their intention to maintain slavery as a business, the opposition that was mounted to stop them from doing that. And in the current era, we're in the thick of it because why? Because right now, Neptune is in fact about to enter those degrees of Aries. And if we look at the world situation, meaning periods when the entire world finds itself in conflict, Second World War, once again, Uranus is in the same place at its return point. Because keep in mind, the other thing about this planet is that it was discovered almost concurrent with the American experiment. The Uranus discovery is 1782, in that range, the American founding of the American system as a country, 1776, in the same range. And indeed, Uranus, to my understanding, is the most democratic planet, and in its association with Aquarius reveals the idea of the individual having power but within the group. You know, it's not the idea of one individual ruling everything like an emperor or a king, which is much more Pluto's domain. Uranus is power to everyone at the same time, the essence of democracy, literally. And so that happens in the late 18th century. Then, 84 years later, roughly, you get the American conflict. The world wasn't doing that well at that time either. There was a lot of conflict throughout the planet, but definitely in the Second World War, you have Uranus returning to those degrees. At that point, Neptune, instead of being where it is today, it's on the other side. It's in Libra, leads up to the war in Virgo, and then goes into Libra as the war is being fought. And this is what signals that the country then was united, the country meaning the US, to fight the Second World War, whereas 80 or so years before, during the Civil War, it was at odds with itself, which is what mirrors what is happening today. And so the point to all this is to realize that currently we're experiencing a very similar conflict, and the lead up was also very similar. Lots of disinformation, lots of twisting facts to make things fit in a certain way. This was, in recent years, has been Neptune in Pisces since 2011. In fact, I remember the second half of the Obama administration and the incredible amount of lying and deceiving that the GOP was engaging in. They would do something and blame the Democrats, and there was no connection at all. They were doing it themselves, things like that. And so during this period, similar to the opposite sign, you know, in the Second World War, the one in the Pisces as well in the 1850s, in a sense, you're prepping the populace to be more and more divided. Then you get a conflict. Now, at least for now, and let's hope it remains, and I'm reasonably confident it will remain this way, it's more of a cold civil war. But then the only answer to this is that we have to get through it. We have to go through these years to get to the other side. And I generally feel encouraged when I see prior cycles that featured similar conflicts. Certainly the Civil War was like this, and even the Second World War. If you think about what was happening in both those cases, there was a struggle to maintain democracy, because the same thing happened in the Second World War. That was an extreme form of trying to implement, you know, fascism, literally. Germany, Japan, Italy, Spain was in on it, There were a lot of dictators involved in this. So here we are again, and once again, I'm confident that democracy can triumph, but it comes at a cost. It comes at the cost of realignment. It comes at the cost of considerable anxiety along the way. But the past informs us this way, and the one feature that you see now around why the impulse to fascistic ideas, especially in the US, is the return of Pluto for the US chart, which is in late Capricorn but moves its way into early Aquarius when you do some precessional correcting, which you need to for something that has been around for this long. When individual charts, you correct about a degree at age 72, but in the case of a country like the US, quarter of a millennium, you're up past 3 degrees. So essentially, this administration started its tenure on the Pluto return, and all of these things that you're seeing that they're trying to do, let's just say they smell like Pluto. They are Pluto. That's exactly what it is. But Pluto will keep moving. Indeed, being an Aquarius is also not helpful to the fascist objectives, because in the longer term, it's going to be an Aquarius till 2044, basically. And that sign is not friendly to fascists because Aquarius, once again, is associated with Uranus. So it's a matter of seeing it out. And from the perspective of elections, which is what drives democracies, there's one in 2024, then the next major election is in 2028, whereupon Uranus is then returning. And I remember doing this thought experiment back at the time of November 2024. Trump is going to be president, and I think, well, what if this had been, if Kamala Harris had won? Well, then you go into the next election in an extremely divided period with Uranus returning, and the odds of change from one to the other increase, and can increase pretty dramatically. So actually, from that vantage point, this situation is better. Separately, you've heard me say quite a few times that this experiment, this horrible experiment with Trumpism that goes back to 2016, it has a grip on the country at the moment. You could say there's no better way. You could say there may be no other way to do this than to go through it in order for enough people to reject it. And when I say enough, I mean that don't expect everybody, especially in divided times, to reject it. You just have to get enough people to reject it in order to then get a better form of governance. And it's definitely there in the planets. There's no question in my mind that that's the case. And in fact, there are more patterns like this that I'll be presenting in future videos. When you look at something that is quite fascinating, when you look at planets, not just in their signs, which is called longitude, you look at, Aries, Taurus, Gemini, whatever, but you look at where the planets are relative to the sun's northernmost and southernmost points, meaning that planets can be somewhere in between there, or they might be north or south of those north and south points, in which case those planets get enhanced and really empowered. And I've seen some really interesting patterns that you can look back on that also tell us how long this is likely to last. But I'll leave that for a future video. In terms of the near situation, it would be that, as I see it, major change coming in 2028, although I'm guessing continued resistance from the losers for at least 2 to 4 more years, going into the end of the decade, early next decade. But obviously, if you've got a better form of governance, it's going to improve things dramatically. But in the meantime, we need to prepare ourselves for the fact that we have to traverse this territory for these years. That's how I understand it.